All right, welcome everybody this afternoon to our guest lecture here in our Lunch and Learn series on perceptions of Canadian provinces. And we're joined today by David Coletto from Ottawa. David is one of the founding partners and CEO of Abacus Data. He has over 8 years of experience in the marketing and research industry and is an industry leader in online research methodologies. He has advised elected officials and senior level decision makers at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. He's currently an adjunct professor at the Arthur Cover College of Public Affairs at Carleton University, where he previously earned a Bachelor of Arts in Public Affairs and Policy Management. He also has an MA from Carleton and a doctorate from the University of Calgary. David's here to talk to us a bit about Abacus's research as it relates to perceptions of Canadian provinces over time. And we're very lucky to have his firm and David doing this kind of research because there's very little other similar information that's being collected like this, and it's useful for people who work in intergovernmental relations and students of Canadian. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, David, and I'm going to mute our line over here so that we don't create any confusion on the line.
Great, thanks, Jared. Can you see me? Is the first question. If you can just unmute and let me know.
I can see it.
All right, I'm going to put up my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, I can.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Jared. I'm all the way here from, it's actually a nice day here in Ottawa. What I'm going to do today is, as Jared said, talk a little bit about some of the research we've done over the last 2 years. Some of it really new, that email Jared sent around with the news release on our best and worst provinces, but as well bring in some research that we've done around Canadians' perceptions around how the Federation works and some other questions we asked around Alberta. So I'm going to focus on Alberta, obviously, for my audience, but I'll talk a little bit about other provinces as well and how Canadians in other parts of the country might be thinking about the Federation and how well or not well that it's working. So I want to start with a question we often ask about all different types of brands or things that we're testing about, and that's what words come to mind when you think of Alberta. And we asked this question back in December 2012, and what we do is we allow respondents in a national representative survey to basically type in or tell us 3 words, the 3 words that come to mind, and then what I like to do is put them into a word cloud to show you what are the top 60 words after we cleaned them up and did some spell check. These are the top 60 words that we found, and it's clear, and this includes some Albertans, whatever the sample size would have for a representative sample, but you know, the image that Alberta has on the top of mind of most Canadians is not surprising, right? The oil sands, Calgary Stampede, conservative, cowboys, cold, and jobs in the economy really stand out as sort of that top line image that Canadians overall have of Alberta. And that's similar to some other things we've done. We did a similar exercise with Newfoundland and Labrador, and the stereotypes and what you would expect people to say of Newfoundland and Labrador, what you might be thinking yourselves right now, were true. We see things like cold, remote, desolate, oil, fish, and the rock would be the equivalent for Newfoundland and Labrador. So there are, I think, built-in stereotypes that people have and images that people have of different provinces depending on, obviously, where you live. Now, when we look at more traditional type research and we ask Canadians specifically, what's your overall impression of Alberta? And this was, again, back in December 2012, so things could have changed slightly since then. But back then, less than 2 years ago, 54% of Canadians that we surveyed, over 1,000 people who answered our survey, had a favorable impression of the province compared to 16% who had an unfavorable impression. And when we look at some key regional or demographic groups that you know, we might see some significant differences, well, good thing, Albertans like Alberta. 81% of Albertans have a favorable impression of their own province, whereas Quebecers, although not significantly different than other parts of the country, were the least favorable. 47% of Quebecers we surveyed said they had a favorable impression. The only other meaningful demographic difference that we found was around age, where for whatever reason, and I'm not necessarily clear why, but younger Canadians across the country were less likely to have a favorable impression, whereas those over 60, those age 60 and over, were more likely. So this impression of Alberta is fairly positive. In fact, just as positive. Again, the only other province we've done something similar is Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's just as popular or just as favorable as that province. Although Newfoundland and Labrador has some challenges with Quebec, and that shows up in our data, whereas Alberta doesn't have, I think, although slightly, and we see a little bit of negativity in British Columbia, and I think that's stemming largely from the conflict and the fight we saw at this time, particularly around Northern Gateway and other pipeline projects. So there seems to be maybe a little bit of cross-border conflict, but being driven mainly by British Columbians, not Albertans, towards that issue, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Some other, I think, perceptions around the Federation having to do with Alberta are some questions we asked around resource wealth, Alberta, and the rest of the country. And this again was from December 2012, and we asked, do you agree or disagree that Canadians from all provinces benefit from Alberta's oil and gas industry? So here you can see vast majority of Canadians, 6 out of 10, agree with the statement that everybody benefits from the great resources that Alberta has. Interestingly, British Columbians were most likely to disagree. So a 10-point variation there. 36% of British Columbians, although the sample sizes are small, so you have to keep some caution. It's a noticeable difference there in in British Columbia, and somewhat lesser so in Quebec. But BC really, at this point in time, standed out as being most likely to disagree with this statement. When we flip this idea on its head and say, are Canadians from other provinces, are they jealous of Alberta's resources, natural resources? And here again, a very slight majority, 50% of Canadians that we surveyed agreed with the statement. Interestingly, 75% of Albertans that were in our sample agreed with this statement, whereas Ontarians, being the good neutral arbiters that we always are, were most likely to disagree. So there was a lot of variation around this question, but even the 75% in Alberta was not enough to lift the national average. There's a lot of agreement around this jealousy question in other parts of the country. So what does this all mean then for the Canadian Federation? And we asked a number of other questions. One that political scientists often ask is, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the way the Federation works in Canada? Not surprisingly, a large number of Canadians are not even sure. They don't pay attention to this. But generally speaking, at least more people are satisfied than dissatisfied. Interestingly, Albertans are most satisfied, at least in December 2012, with how the Federation works. You wouldn't be surprised to think that Quebecers were the lowest. It was the only province where more people were dissatisfied with the Federation than were satisfied. So Quebec, it was 39% who were satisfied. And I remember at the time, the PQ had more or less recently won a minority government there. Things have changed in Quebec, so it would be interesting to see how this plays today. Another important question related to the Federation is, do you think one province gets more than its fair share? Again, perceptions, not reality in this case. 63% said yes. And of that 63%, if I did a little internal survey there and asked you, which province do you think Canadians think gets more than its fair share, you'd probably all, I think, say Quebec. And that's what the majority of those who said yes to the previous question selected. And we see a very interesting regional divide on this question. So if you live west of the Ottawa River, in Ontario and west, 6 in 10, or over 6 in 10 in all those regions picked Quebec as getting more than its fair share from the Federation. If you live east of the Ottawa River, the response is much more split, where Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta are basically tied with about a third each. Atlantic Canadians obviously more likely to say Quebec than Quebecers are, but still Alberta enters the mix when you get east of the Ottawa River. Interestingly, 1 in 4 Atlantic Canadians and Quebecers think Alberta gets more than its fair share. So, Alberta this number, why Alberta's third on this list, is being driven largely by people east of Ontario. Last question when it comes to how different provinces are treated in the Federation. More political, but we asked, do you think the current federal Conservative government favors one province in Canada over other regions? And a much closer outcome here, just under 6 in 10 said yes. And you ask those people, which province do you think the Tory government in Ottawa favors? Well, Alberta comes ahead on this question. So while overall Canadians think Quebec gets the better end of the stick in terms of the Federation as a whole, when it comes to the Stephen Harper government, Alberta is seen as being the beneficiary. And interestingly, again, some regional differences. Albertans pick Ontario and Quebec, so those traditional regional feelings towards the East and Central Canada are still exist. Ontarians and Quebecers, interestingly, half of them picked in both provinces Alberta as the favorite of the Harper government. And interestingly, British Columbia sort of falls in between, with the vast majority of, not the vast, sorry, 70% of British Columbians picking either Ontario or Quebec, but 24% picking Alberta. So BC, some in BC might be feeling as though they're being left out, and the West wants in notion might be leaving them out. And we get to that point next when we asked about regional conflict. So we asked this question, here's a list of currently existing or hypothetical or potential regional conflicts that might exist in Canada. And do you think that that conflict is either very serious, somewhat serious, not that serious, or not at all serious in your opinion? And we tested 5, and these are the national results. So Quebec versus the rest of Canada, 8 out of 10 respondents said that's either a very serious or somewhat serious conflict. And that's, I don't think, too surprising. But interestingly, Alberta versus the rest of Canada back in 2012 in December came second, slightly ahead of West versus East. Interestingly, and something that I'm going to hope to track this December, is this question around British Columbia versus Alberta. That in 2012 in December, only a quarter of Canadians a quarter of Canadians overall thought that was either a very serious or somewhat serious conflict. And when we look specifically at what Albertans told us, overall the trend wasn't that different, although West versus East sort of leapfrogged ahead of the Alberta versus rest of Canada conflict. It's interesting when we look at the differentials with the national average, the West versus Eastern Canada conflict was seen as being more serious among Albertans than with Canadians in general, whereas the BC versus Alberta narrative or conflict was seen as less serious, or less likely to be seen as serious in Alberta than in other parts of the country. So Albertans have similar views to the rest of the country, but the conflict that might be perceived to exist between BC and Alberta doesn't really show up among Albertans, at least at the time. Again, these perceptions might have changed. Last question related to the Federation was trying to get a little more specific. And remember, the context of why we asked these questions at the time is we had the Premier of BC, Christy Clark, and Alberta Premier at the time, Alison Redford, having, I guess, their little tiff about Northern Gateway Pipeline and the conditions that Christy Clark was putting in place. We wanted to test whether they thought that the conflict between East and West, and this also, sorry, I should add some more context. We also had Tom Mulcair, talking about Dutch disease and so on here in Ottawa. We wanted to see whether people thought in the next 20 years, which of the following will pose the greater challenge to Canadian unity. And 2 years ago, it was still overwhelmingly Quebec versus the rest of Canada. Again, keeping in mind that the PQ was the government in Quebec, and that's no longer the case. So I'm gonna try to update these this December, and I can give you an update of this. But this was to give you a sense of where I think Canadians as a whole are when it comes to our federation. Overall, pretty good satisfaction, but obviously opportunities for improvement, as well as some threats in terms of different regions and different provinces. The next section now, I think, is the more, which was meant to be more of a fun or interesting type of research, less academic in nature, but it was to give Canadians the list of all the provinces and ask them a question and give them the opportunity to pick which province is, for example, best managed and which is worst managed. And we've done this now for 3 years. What's interesting is that Alberta comes ahead of the other provinces on 3 of the lists, and they're all positive attributes, which is good, unless you like paying more income taxes. You would, I guess, not think it's good that Alberta comes first on there in terms of lowest income. But the other interesting finding over the 3 years is that none of the provinces have changed first place. So the categories I'm about to show you, Alberta has led for 3 years in a row, and no province has moved from its top spot. We see some movement in second and third, but that's largely, I think, due to statistical differences as opposed to real perceptual differences. So if we start with the province Canadians think is best managed, I gave it away. Alberta came well ahead on this question. They're up 5 points from last year, so these numbers in the middle of your screen represent the movement from the previous year's survey, which we always do in June, right before Canada Day. Ontario down slightly, 4 points from 2013, with BC, Saskatchewan, and Quebec well back in fifth. Quebec down slightly. When we look at who selected Alberta across the country, it was the top choice in every region except for respondents living in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. There, Saskatchewan came slightly ahead. 63% of Albertans picked Alberta as the best managed province. And again, there was a fairly strong consensus among demographic groups, political groups, regional groups that Alberta came ahead on this question. And that's despite what some would describe as a challenging time for the province in terms of its leadership. This all despite that, Alberta still comes ahead on this question in terms of perceptions. When it comes to worst managed, again, not a surprise, I think, from most people's minds, is that Quebec and Ontario well ahead of any other province. No real change from the previous year. What's interesting is you would assume that people who live in that, people who live in Quebec wouldn't pick Quebec as the worst managed, but that's not the case. Quebecers were just as hard on their own province as Canadians from outside of Quebec were. And among Alberta, although it's tied for second, it's well back at 7%, only 13% of Albertans thought Alberta was the worst managed province in the country. So some interesting differences there, and perceptions of Ontario and Quebec, and Ontarians and Quebecers being quite difficult on their own province. When it comes to taxes, Alberta runs away with who has the lowest income taxes, and we used income taxes as the term here. Top choice in every region of the country. 60% of Albertans selected Alberta as having the lowest taxes, and there's no other country that really has built up the perception that it's a low income tax jurisdiction. None of the other provinces stand out. So it's a fairly strong consensus built up around Alberta, and it's up 4 points from the previous year. When it comes to the question of who has the highest income taxes, it's a tie between Ontario and Quebec again, largely because Ontarians and Quebecers think they pay the highest income tax. So because they're the largest population and we don't equalize each respondent's answer, when they select themselves or they gang up and select another province, that province usually rises to the top. But the same is true of British Columbians, who also think they pay quite a fair share of their taxes. So not a lot of regional differences on this question. It's very localized. 14% of Albertans picked Alberta as the jurisdiction. So again, a very positive self-perception that Albertans have of themselves. I think another really interesting question is it comes to, and the previous two I think are related to this one, is which province is the best and worst to open a new business? And on this question, Alberta comes ahead again, up 4 points from 2013, with Ontario second, down slightly, and the rest of the order not changing. British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Quebec in fifth place. So you notice, oftentimes, at least on these economic questions, none of the Atlantic Canadian provinces really show up, other than Newfoundland and Labrador at some points. Alberta was the top choice as the best place to open a business in every region of the country except for in Ontario. And again, Albertans are very proud of their own province. 82% picked Alberta as the best place to open a business, which is much higher than any other resident of a province gave their own province. So very positive feelings about Alberta. Worst place to open a business, much more diverse here in terms of the response. Quebec comes slightly ahead of Newfoundland and Labrador. Ontario is also on this list, with PEI and Saskatchewan rounding at the top 5. Alberta really doesn't play at all in this category, so they win on best place to open a business and really don't show at all on worst. So a very positive view of Alberta here. Moving on to some other topics, we've tracked this question for the last 3 years. I think British Columbia has benefited from the fact that they put this on their license plate and it's all over their slogan, but beautiful British Columbia comes well ahead of any other province on most beautiful scenery. BC leads in every region except in Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canadians were more likely to pick Newfoundland and Labrador as most beautiful, although BC comes second there. And only 6% of Canadians picked Alberta, although they're tied for fourth, with 18% of Albertans picking Alberta as most beautiful. There hasn't been much movement on this question. When it comes to least beautiful, which is always the hardest question to ask, Saskatchewan comes ahead here again. This is the 3rd year in a row that Saskatchewan has been named the least beautiful, with Manitoba second. So for whatever reason, Canadians think the prairies are ugly or not as beautiful as other parts of the country. And there's lots of media that often gets played in Saskatchewan around this question. So we haven't seen much movement there. Alberta's 6% on this list. Last 2 categories, most and least friendly people. Again, because this is something that everybody, I think, thinks of their own as being friendly, we see lots of variation, no clear winner, although Newfoundland and Labrador came ahead again for the 3rd year in a row. Quebecers, this is where we start to see some, I think, some localism. Quebecers overwhelmingly pick themselves as the most friendly, as do Ontarians, and so we don't see much variation, although this is Nova Scotia's first appearance in the top 4 of one of these issues. Who selected Alberta? Albertans selected themselves, are more likely to select themselves than other provinces, and it really was driven by people picked their own province as the most friendly. When it comes to least friendly, well, here English Canada really gangs up on Quebec as being the least friendly people in the country, and Ontario comes second. So the hate-on for Ontario continues to exist, and Alberta, BC, and Manitoba aren't really showing here, but they're on the list in the top 5. The last question we asked is, what province, other than your own, would you most like to visit on vacation? And so if we think of the results from the most beautiful, there's a strong correlation here. British Columbia comes ahead at 35%, followed by PEI, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia. So although most Canadians don't think of those Atlantic provinces as being places they may want to start a business or move to, it is a place that a lot of them want to visit. And Alberta comes 5th on this list at 8%. No real change from last year. And BC leads in every region. 17% of British Columbians picked Alberta and Ontario. So BC residents were the most likely to pick Alberta as a place to visit, maybe driven by how close they are to Alberta. So just to wrap up quick, and then I can open it up for some questions. Canadians associate Alberta most closely with its natural resources, its economic prowess and power, and the Calgary Stampede. Clearly, that comes from our open-ended exercise. Most Canadians have a favorable impression of Alberta. Most think that all Canadians benefit from the resources that Alberta has, and so it's obviously a net contributor to the Federation and to the country, but obviously there's some recognition that some people are jealous of what Alberta has. most Canadians are most likely to select Alberta as the province with the lowest income taxes, the best place to open a business, and the best managed province in the country, which are all great attributes to have. And so I conclude by saying I think the image of the province is quite strong, looking at data from 2012 as well as most recent data, despite some of the challenges that maybe the province has faced in public relations. I don't think it's had too much of effect on the overall view and its role in federation. So I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hey, thanks, David, very much for that, for those insights, and I really appreciate you tailoring some of those national, the national data for us here in Alberta to give us a better sense of what the underlying regional dynamics were. So that's great. I'll turn it over to folks in the room if they have any questions. Yes.
Can you hear me all the way?
Yeah.
A quick question. How would your data be applied to, let's say, a question on establishing internal or internal free trade zones in Canada?
I don't have I've never asked that question or seen any data around that. My assumptions would be most Canadians assume that we have free trade between our provinces. So I think I would be shocked to see that a majority of the country even knows that there's significant trade barriers between the provinces, and so I think that's why the issue itself will have a difficult time getting traction as something Canadians care about, because the first step is to, I think, educate them. But that's based off of other research I've done measuring the public's awareness of a range of other policy areas. My sense is they probably have no idea how difficult it might be, except for when they go into here in Ontario a liquor store and we can't find, BC wine as an example. I can't hear you.
Oh, hello? Can you hear me?
I'm back now.
I was just wondering about your own opinion towards free trade zones in Canada.
Oh, so you didn't hear my last answer?
No, we heard you. I think we're asking about your own opinion. So, do you think that there's some room for growth in terms of free trade within Canada? Putting on your political science hat.
Oh, okay. So away from what the public would care about it, I think there is, but I still think bringing in, does the public think this is a priority that government needs to deal with? If you're a politician in a country, in one of the provinces, trying to figure out whether this is an issue that you should take leadership around, as Brad Wall's done, I think perhaps he's doing it for national aspirations as opposed to provincial ones, and the challenge is more about explaining first that there isn't free trade zones and that Canada actually has freer trade with other countries than it does with some of the provinces internally, is the first step. And I don't see, there's not a lot of political benefit or downside to either doing it or not doing it, and that makes it one of those policy areas that might be difficult to get off the ground. However, if you're going to have competing ministers and premiers trying to one-up each other, that's a way to do it. So in the context of a non-existent leadership race for the leader of the federal Conservatives, that could be a way to do it.
Just to recap, David, I mean, your sense, and you do polling hourly, the issue of internal trade not even on the radar for most Canadians.
No, and I mean, I haven't asked specifically about it, so and I think, and the reason I probably won't is because I don't think people have any sense of it. It's one of those non-opinions that we would be measuring. And when you ask what's the most important issue, healthcare and jobs in the economy are still 1 and 2, and they move over each other. The question then is, if you are in favor of opening up trade between provinces, any proponent of that is going to have to make a clear link between, is Canada, for example, now falling behind other G7 countries in growth because of these limits to internal trade? You've got to find a way to hitch that very uninteresting and unsexy policy to the concerns largely of the public. And as you go into a federal election, and all the provincial elections that might be coming up, that are coming up next year, there may be an opportunity to do it. The window's opening, but I still think it's going to be a difficult issue to get the attention of the public on. If you can get the business community behind it first, that might be the first step to do that.
Other questions? Yeah, Megan?
Could you speak to the demographics of the people that you polled?
Sure. So this is it's a representative sample. So we make sure it matches the Canadian census according to gender, age, educational attainment, and region. So when I talk about age or gender differences in terms of the perceptions, those are between groups, but the overall numbers would be representative of the country. And we did the survey online using a sample that we've been using for quite some time. So it's not like an online survey where anybody can go and answer it. It's a controlled survey where we built in quotas to make sure we get the right people that we're looking for to build that representative sample.
Sean?
Hi, David. Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I'm wondering a little bit more about your results talking about which province is best managed. Do you have any more detailed information, as in which province is best managed fiscally or on environmental policy or other specific types of policy?
Yeah, you're like the sixth person who's at least publicly asked me to look at that. We just left it very broad as best managed. So I know that leaves it up to interpretation on, are we talking about the economy, the province, what sector? I think maybe next year we might break that out, because there was interest in understanding. I got questions from the arts community saying, which province is best for the arts and environmental protection and sustainable growth and all those different kinds of things. So I can't really give you much more on what that means, other than the interpretation of the question has been fairly similar in that Alberta always comes ahead of other provinces fairly clearly. I think what it is having lived in Alberta and now living in Ontario, I think despite, and I mean no disrespect to Albertans, despite what Albertans might think of how their province is managed, Canadians outside of Alberta look at the wealth and the opportunities that Alberta has and says it must be for some other reason than just simply because you have oil in the ground. And I think it's driving that. So whether it's government policy, the business community, the people as a whole, I think people look at Alberta that way. But I think it's mainly about, when I think well managed, I think about from a government perspective. So there's I think positive perceptions about that outside of Alberta.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions? I guess, David, if we could close with this. I mean, you've given us an overall snapshot, and I know this was especially the second poll that you did here on Canada Day was meant to be more fun, as you say, less political science. But I'm wondering if you could put that political scientist hat back on again and think about, what does this tell us going into 2015 in the fall? I mean, are these perceptions something new in your view? Does it mark a shift in the way that Canadians feel about the Federation? And if so, how might that affect how parties should or will approach the 2015 fall election?
And you're talking at the federal level.
In 2015.
Yeah. Well, I think it does point. I focus more, and I'm going to test the that regional jealousy type angle that we looked at, because I think that is where the federal parties now are deciding how they're going to play it out. Although we've seen less of it from the Liberals than maybe historically they may have been doing, because I think Trudeau and the Liberals see an opportunity in a number of seats in Alberta, and in Western Canada generally, particularly in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they may see there's opportunities there. So I think you're going to see less, although we don't know because they can run their campaigns quite differently in different regions of the country. I still think you're going to see less of a regional campaign from the Liberals because I think they actually believe they've got a very good shot at winning a national government and maybe even forming a majority government across the country. So they've got to find a way, really for the first time for the Liberals, to stitch together a national government because they know that they're not going to get 100 seats in Ontario. That's not likely to happen because the Conservatives are united there still. And in Quebec, there's no guarantee that they can win 75 or 80 seats in Quebec or whatever the new number is going to be. So the Liberals have to find a way to stitch that together. When it comes to the Conservatives, I think regionally they've got big challenges still in Quebec, obviously, but Atlantic Canada is also becoming increasingly a difficult terrain for them. So their goal will be, somehow, and it's not playing that, they can't play the region card either because they've got to keep Ontario and Western Canada together and keep that coalition. Where I think the party that may ultimately turn to regionalism, and we saw it with Tom Mulcair's comments, is the New Democrats. And if they increasingly feel that they have little opportunity in the prairies but see opportunities in British Columbia, you might see some tougher talk around resource development, pipelines, and the oil sands. And that, they think, plays well in downtown Toronto, although it didn't work for them. During the by-election in Trinity-Spadina, you had the New Democrat candidate going fairly heavily against the oil sands, and I think he refers to them as the tar sands. And while it may have riled up their base, it certainly didn't help them win the election. So it remains to be seen whether it will work. But I think as the New Democrat poll numbers don't budge and move, they may see an opportunity to save their Quebec base and some of their more, and I'll quote this, progressive urban seats across the country. They may go tilt farther against oil sands development and natural resources, generally speaking. So there's potential for regionalism, but the way it's increasingly looking is that if it becomes a Liberal versus Conservative race, both parties don't have much incentive to play one region off the other. So we may not see this become as an issue that it could have become if it was an NDP versus Conservative fight.
That in itself is pretty remarkable considering the history of Canadian party politics. Well, we'll have to leave it there. David, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out. We look forward to seeing the results of the next survey, which you say should be out in December or January this year, looking at some of those things that you looked at before about perceptions in the Federation. Point everybody to abacusdata.ca. Is that the right website?
Yep.
For all your latest polling information, all kinds of fun and informative information there. Thanks for joining us, David.
Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.
See ya.
Bye.